So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's ContainerJournal.com panel, brought to you by Techstrong. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of Techstrong Learning. We have an exciting panel ahead of us, but first I have a couple of housekeeping notes. First off, today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion or you'd like to rewatch or share, the on-demand version will be made available shortly after we conclude our live webinar today. If you have any questions, we want you to go ahead and submit those using the Q&A tab, which can be found on the right side of your screen. And I'll also point your attention to the chat tab. This is where we want you to just engage with one another, engage with us. We hope to keep this chat pretty active throughout today's webinar. And finally, at the conclusion of our program today, we'll be giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So be sure to stick around. So our topic today is Kubernetes Governance. And I'm joined today by my esteemed colleague, Mike Vizard, CTO or Chief Content Officer at Techstrong Group, and he'll also be our conversation leader today. So, Mike, I'm going to give you the floor to introduce the rest of our panel.
All right. Well, the rest of our panel, we have Rachel Sweeney from Fairwinds. Rachel, say hi.
Hey, everyone. Super excited to be here.
All right. We have Hasib. There you are, Budhani from his outfit. Hasib, take a minute and describe your company because I don't know if everybody knows your outfit per se.
Sure. Yeah, every time I talk to Mike, he takes about 5 seconds to say my first name. So it's not that hard. But so I'm part of a company named Rafi. We are in the Kubernetes operations space. We help the large enterprises get their automation right for Kubernetes, be it multi-cloud, single cloud, edge plus cloud. Every enterprise invests a lot of time and resources writing that automation and governance layer that sits on top of Kubernetes. We sell that as a SaaS offering. And you as an enterprise can be up and running with Kubernetes, again, in the cloud, multiple clusters, multiple teams, in minutes. That's the pitch. Nice to meet you all.
All right, Ritesh. Ritesh, would you like to introduce yourself and your company?
Absolutely. Hey, folks, I'm Ritesh Patel. I'm founder at Nirmata. We are the company behind an open source policy engine called Kyverno. And based on our experience with open source and with Kyverno, we've built out a platform for policy management, governance, as well as operations for Kubernetes, helping enterprises scale their Kubernetes deployments.
All right. And Mohammed?
All right. Hello, everyone. This is Mo from Weaveworks. I joined Weaveworks as part of an acquisition. I'm previously the co-founder and CEO of a company called Magalix. We were in the space of policy as code. We're built on top of OPA. I guess we're going to talk more about that. But now we provide the trusted delivery by combining the GitOps and the policy and security as code in one unified platform. Nice meeting everyone.
All right. All right. And finally, Justin.
Hey, it's Justin from StrongDM. So our role is all about when those team members come to you and say, hey, can I have access to that cluster? So we are all about the people first access dimension of the governance problem at StrongDM.
All right. And in interest of equal time, Rachel is from Fairwinds. They are a managed service provider. They made contributions to a variety of open source projects. And Rachel's going to take our first question, which is, clearly Kubernetes is one of the most powerful platforms to come down the pike in a long time, but it's also the most challenging. So what exactly, from your perspective, makes Kubernetes governance different from all the other platforms we've seen over the years that people know how to manage, but seemingly Kubernetes is a little more challenging? But what's at the core of that?
Yeah, thank you, Mike. And yeah, sorry, I introduced myself, but not Fairwinds. Yeah, we have a software as a service. We have a lot of open source. And yeah, our software as a service is around governance and helping people with cost efficiency and just best practices for how to use Kubernetes. And so through all of that, we spend a lot of time thinking about governance and just, how it works and how it works in Kubernetes specifically. And I think the thing to me that I really like about governance in Kubernetes is that, there's a lot of different ways things can get into a Kubernetes cluster. It can be through your CI/CD pipeline. Somebody could be there in the command line actually putting something into Kubernetes, or it could even be something within Kubernetes generating more resources. And Kubernetes has a concept of an admission controller. And it's kind of like a last check to say, should this be allowed in the cluster or not? And by default, as long as you have permission, you can just put something in the cluster. And so this is just a natural place for us to be able to build in governance and essentially say, essentially be able to allow us to give a rubber stamp to let something through, or say, this does not pass, the governance policies that we've set forth. So we don't want to let something into the cluster. And I think that's a really neat part about Kubernetes, is how that's just a check right there before something gets into the cluster.
Now, Steve, do you think that that's a plus or a minus? Because some folks I would talk to might say, well, geez, why wasn't that built into the cluster in the first place? And isn't that core? And what is not core in Kubernetes? And where does governance fit in the Kubernetes model?
I think the beauty of Kubernetes is that it's such an open system. I was thinking about, Ritesh is, of course, part of Nirmata, which is focusing on Kyverno, and Mo is at Moglix, which is an OPA kind of based platform. I got to tell you, we have, I don't know what the percentage is, but probably 50-50, half of our customers use Kyverno, half of our customers use OPA, right? And they're both pretty happy, right? And they both have strong reasons why would they use one versus the other. And it's easy to do, right? Because Kubernetes is an open system. It allows you to bring all these different technologies. You could use StrongDM, or you could use Dex, or, there's all these different options to manage access, for example. Speaking to Justin's company, I think that's the beauty of Kubernetes. It's an open system. You get to decide what you want to do, but that, with great power comes great responsibility. You got to kind of now figure out, what do I do? How do I control all these different access points? And I think that is fundamentally the biggest problem that enterprises face. I think, I always tell our new sales team members here at Rafi, most enterprises, I say this in jest, most enterprises don't care about security, they care about compliance and governance. Security is not why they do things, they do good for compliance and governance. People want to know, who did what? Are you allowed to do this? Is my cluster the same as it was a month ago? These are actually pretty simple questions, but they have very complicated answers, right? So first, Kubernetes allows you to do it. You want it to be this flexible. That's the right thing to do, because you can actually make it do the things that you want to do as an enterprise, but then you have to have these controls in place. Otherwise, this is not an enterprise-ready platform. So both must be true. Yes, there's pain, but then the good news is, just on this call, we have so many great companies who are solving the governance problem. And enterprise have a lot of options to pick from. I think this is great. I think the way this market is working out, Mike. I mean, I've been doing this a long time now. It's fascinating to see how fast this market is moving. It's fascinating to see how quickly our community determines what gaps exist. In a like OPA existed, it's great, but then Rego is so hard. And then rotation team came about and said, well, you don't need Rego anymore. Here's a simpler way to do it. It's just the way, the speed at which evolution is happening in this industry is fascinating. It's great. All the right things are happening in this market right now, in my opinion.
Yeah, just to add to what Hasib said, right, and Kubernetes by default, kind of it's optimized for ease of use for a developer or a single cluster standpoint, right? You can get started very quickly, get value out of it, or see value out of it very quickly. But I think the challenge comes in as you start scaling Kubernetes. Again, when I say scaling, it's not just about having more clusters, but enabling more teams to start using Kubernetes, enabling more applications to be deployed on Kubernetes. And when you start doing that, that's when you really want to think about governance and making sure that everybody's kind of nobody's stepping on each other's toes, and you're getting the visibility compliance necessary to operate it at enterprise scale, right? And I think that's kind of why governance at scale at which governance becomes really, really important.
Justin, let me ask you this as a follow-up to that. When do you think governance becomes an issue? Is this something that people are thinking about before they start rolling out Kubernetes clusters, or does it start showing up when I have 5, 10, 15? When does this kind of become top of mind problem?
So of course it depends on the company archetype and whether you're starting something from scratch or whether you're maybe migrating a workload where you have some governance precedent in your existing operations and you're trying to sort of port that over. I will say to Ritesh's point, the fact that the product is optimized, Kubernetes itself for, I think you said ease of use, but let's say adoptability by a developer. At that first moment of adoption, when you're just focused on getting something functional, it is natural to think about governance topics later, right? On the other hand, if you're deploying an application in a commercial environment, you only care about governance if your data is important. And it seems like a minority of companies that would say their data isn't important. As much as I think Haseeb mentioned compliance versus security. I definitely think increasingly it's both. And I actually think the mix of achieving security while achieving compliance, I think we are going to experience that shift.
Mohammed, who's in charge of governance in these environments? Because a lot of times it seems to me, at least, that it starts out with developers, or we're going to deploy something in a cloud native format and we're going to go out and get Kubernetes clusters. But it's not clear to me that they even care or think about governance. So at what point does somebody else in IT get involved, and what is their relationship, or how is that evolving?
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe I would take a step back and try just to define governance a bit differently, because for many developers that might sound a bit negative, and they may think that governance is something that would constrain them. But if you look at governance as a way to basically help you innovate faster, but in a safe environment, in an environment where you can still move fast, but your mistakes are not going to basically cause you downtime and be in firefighting mode all the time. If you think of it this way, then in that case, it's going to be natural for developers to start thinking about it. Because at the end of the day, yes, it's easy to get into Kubernetes. It's easy to get lots of services and applications deployed to it. But with this actually comes a lot of danger, right? Because you can easily shoot yourself in the foot. And in that case, rather than innovating and building stuff, you're going to find yourself in firefighting, as I mentioned, and trying to fix lots of issues because as a result of moving fast, but without having the proper governance. Now, thinking about it this way, of course, the typical answer would be it's everyone's responsibility. The developers, the security engineers, if you have that role, and of course the operators. But the challenge here is how do you make all those three roles work together? A typical example that I give, in our demos or meetings, who is responsible for giving the container or controlling the container access rights to the VM? Is it the developer, the operator, or the security engineer? Because they're all, all those guys have interest in that. The developer would like to get as much resources as possible. The operator would like to make sure that the container is deployed consistently and running without any issues. The security engineer would like to protect the assets, whether this is data or the VM itself and so on. Now, making sure that all those three work together is a challenge. So the short answer, all of them, but you need to find a common ground and a common language. Kubernetes actually is making that possible by default because everything is standardized and automated inside it. But adding that layer that would create a common language for all those three roles and sensible workflows is key. And I think that's the topic of this is how the topic of governance in general should be handled within different companies.
All right. You guys all agree with that, or is there a different way of thinking about it?
May I add something, Mike?
Yeah, go.
So I think most perspective is sound in that that's the right way to think about it. But unfortunately, sometimes in practice, the following ends up happening. And this is my experience now. I mean, this is what we do all day long. I mean, and I find that my primary day job is sales now. Every large enterprise, there's one team that says, I'm going to do Kubernetes. And they go do it, and they're really good at it, and they go set up stuff, and it's working, and EKS, and whatever EKS, AKS, whatever they want to use. They got Kubernetes working. They have pipelines working. It's great. And then a second team pops up, and maybe they don't know Kubernetes as well as they should, and maybe a third team pops up. And at some point, somebody says, senior person says, why do I have all these DevOps people in each of these teams? I got to do this centrally. And then they have a platform organization. And that platform organization also has people who are also part of like the center of excellence or architecture team. And then they go, whoa, 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 hold on. How do we know, do we have a standard for how our cluster should be built? Is there a blueprint? That, by the way, is a governance issue also. By the way, how do you know your cluster is the same? That I find that enterprise IT teams actually have that's the biggest question they have. Are you sure you're running the Prisma compute thing and the OPA thing and maybe Kubernetes or Ritesh, or whatever, right? I mean, you create a policy list of things, and are you sure they're all running everywhere? How do you know a developer who has cluster order binding did not delete your specific admission controller because, well, they have cluster order binding, they can do anything. This is what happens, and then now people start thinking about governance. This is what I've seen. Of course, you fast forward, people are thinking about governance, but this is how it starts. It starts with, some really sharp engineers. They kind of put stuff together. And then a second team comes in, a third team comes in, and now you got to go, well, hold on, I got too many clusters. I got to take a pause here and really think about what is my governance strategy. Now, at that point, that first team, do they care about governance? Yeah, in theory, sure, but they're busy. They're writing code, right? They're writing code, they're checking it in. This is not their problem. So then usually in an enterprise, there's some central organization that really has to think about this, right? Call them platform teams. That's what they're mostly called, or architecture teams or whatever. But there's a central organization. They come up with a policy. As an example, I don't know Kubernetes as well, so I'll speak to OPA. No clusters in my company can reach Docker Hub and just pull stuff down. Not allowed. Okay, go make it happen in every cluster in your company. That's governance as one example, or whatever. Or, hey, if you don't set limits on your containers, you're not going to get to deploy your applications. That's a policy, right? Oh, by the way, Justin can see these 3 clusters, but Rachel can see all of them because she's part of platform. Governance. This comes, in my opinion, a little bit after, because people, usually there's some really sharp people who just go, right? And then they go and they say, look, I don't want to do this anymore. You take it from me. I want to write my code. I want to check it in. I want magic to happen. Argo, whatever. I don't care about this anymore. And then we usually look for that team. We as Rafi, my job is to look for that platform organization who's struggling with this. They're struggling with cluster provisioning. They're struggling with pipeline setup. They're struggling with policy management. They're struggling with backup. They're struggling with, service mesh management, right? This team is trying to do this across multiple organizations. Ritesh said this before, right? That it's never about a single cluster. If you get like one cluster in the world, or 2 or maybe 3, it's not a big deal. But if you got multiple internal teams, each of them may have 1 or 2 clusters or more, who knows what's going on, then you got pain, right? And that's an enterprise that's out there looking for some platform solution that solves that problem.
And I think, just to add to that, I think it is nice that I like that broader view of governance because, like you said, there are a lot of ways to shoot yourself in the foot with Kubernetes. And we know that if we have this configuration and we set this other thing into the cluster, it's going to break in this particular way. And so it's a very logical way of thinking about something so that we can put rules in place so that you can't shoot yourself in the foot. So it doesn't just have to be something like, SOC 2 compliance is a great reason to have governance and have things like this in place. And if that's something that you already have, you're going to be thinking about that when you're, getting your cluster up and running. And going back to your point about multiple clusters, we work with a lot of different companies that we will run into an issue in one cluster, and that's when we will put governance in place that we can then spin out to all their other clusters. So that way, no matter which team it is, they still have those same guardrails that would put somebody in the ditch, regardless of, whether they want to move fast. It's just something that if you do A and you do B and you combine them, something's going to break and it's not going to work. And so we know that, and that's where we can put these rules in place and use this, software as a service. We see this at Fairwinds all the time, and it's something that we can do to put those rules and help people out before they, shoot themselves in the foot.
Yeah. Justin, let me ask you as a follow-up to that, are you seeing the emergence of what we might call governance as code, where people are using APIs to kind of embed the governance into their flow, or are the ops teams still looking for some sort of graphical tool that allows them to manage those policies and kind of manage that environment? Or is it kind of like, to each his own and whoever favors either approach?
Sure. So I'll say the importance of having some sort of a user interface or a really ergonomic command line tool. I think the sort of in the more mature patterns, that the read side and explaining what you've got, I think is really well done through an interface. But ideally, a lot of the changes that you're going to want to express they're hopefully manifest in a more structured way. So I would say among our customer base, a lot of folks might start out sort of with some ClickOps, but then inevitably there's going to be some sort of automation. It's not necessarily automation as code precisely, in a sense that there's some sort of declarative set of privileges and entitlements that Mike has, but it might be, for example, just an automated binding to an identity provider, right? And so a combination of the group and role memberships and the identity provider might be flowing through to whatever the authorization engine is. So that's a pretty common arrangement as well.
Yeah. Mohammed, we hear a lot about the emergence of GitOps these days. We have not heard of the emergence of GitGovOps, fortunately, or for that matter, GitSecOps for that matter. But from your perspective, do you agree with Justin? It's becoming part of a larger end-to-end workflow that is an extension of GitOps, or where does it fit?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's what we're trying to to build here at Weaveworks right now with the combined products from Magilix and Weaveworks, and as we call it, the trusted delivery. And again, it comes back to that initial theme, which is you want to move fast. This is basically what we're saying internally: move fast, but do not break things. Right, just as opposed to what Facebook started, and that's what we're trying to do. You would like your developers again to continue to innovate, and to earlier point by Hasib, which is the governance and the idea of governance and so on. There are layers and levels of governance. There's the overall infrastructure. There's your fleet. There's your application. You can go deeper down all the way to the container level. And definitely it's debatable. Where do you start? Do you start at the infrastructure level, or you start at the application level and the container level? And it depends on your role. If you're a developer, you definitely would like to make sure that your application is delivered in a secure way. You're not the weakest point in your stack. And of course, take it from that point. This is one approach, and there's no one approach that would fit, for everyone. The other approach, which is the big enterprise approach, I have many clusters, I have a big infrastructure, I want to standardize that, and I would like to, make sure that that the whole infrastructure is built on the best possible standards and practices. Now, at the end of the day, GitOps is all about standardizing how you build infrastructure, define it, and deliver it, and do it really fast. And it goes from that layer all the way to the application layer. That's the whole idea behind GitOps. Now, add to that the assurance of, I want to make sure that whatever you do there is going to follow the best practices and is going to provide the right layers of governance. And we can talk more about what governance means, because it's a really wide topic. It's about security, it's about standards, it's about organizational practices. There are lots of things that define or building components of governance. But absolutely, this is what we're trying to do at Weaveworks.
May I address something here, Mike?
Yeah, absolutely. Jump right in.
Go ahead, Asif, after you.
Okay, all right. So because you asked about kind of GitOps, and maybe. By the way, the phrase GitOps, as far as I know, was invented by Weaveworks, where Mo works right now. So I think they were the first ones to use the name phrase GitOps, which all of us use now. So kudos. Maybe when we say GitOps, what we're trying to think about our infrastructure as code. It's a way to express. I'm speaking as a sales guy. A way to express any idea as a spec file that I can put in a Git repo, right? So then the question becomes, what is it? What are these things that I can put in a Git repo that I can repeat or reapply to multiple clusters, multiple applications? So I want to describe what my cluster looks like. That's a spec, right? Then I can control it, right? And I can make sure they all look the same. Inside my cluster, I want to control, what components are running on it, right? I want to control what groups in AD map to this cluster. I want to control what applications can or cannot run on this cluster. I want to control the actual policies, right? The actual constraints from OPA. Again, I'm speaking OPA. I don't know Kubernetes started this, but same thing. Each of these things is a file in a Git repo. right? And I can take these files, I can sort of, clone a file. Like if I want to build a cluster, I should be able to clone a file of a cluster. I should be able to change some things. I should be able to submit it. And when the PR is approved by Rachel, my cluster is up and running. And oh, by the way, that references a blueprint, which brings in 10 more things. And each of those 10 things references some other Git repo, and then each of those things references some policy, and boom, 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 right? So now 20 minutes later, my cluster is ready. What did I do as a developer? I need a cluster. That's all I care about, right? But then it brings with it all these other policy ideas that I don't really care about, or I'm too busy. I'm writing my code. I need an environment. I'm writing code. You go figure it out. I think that's where the world seems to be going. So we do that today, by the way. We sell this today. You can buy it today. It's very easy. You can tie OPA and access, all these things into one kind of very simple to use, very small file that you can have in the Git repo, and you don't need to understand very well. So these are concepts that people want, in my opinion, right? I think so long as it's easy to use, so long as it's replicable, so long as I can, essentially clone something and go from here, this is what, in my opinion, developers are looking for. But then on the other side of this, the operations team members who may never become as good at Kubernetes as some others, maybe, right? Because they got other things going on. They want this to be a very simple process that they can control. Git seems to have become the source of truth for everything now. That's the future, or not future, that's the present. And this is how it is now. Git is a source of truth. Everything comes from there. All control, all activity around, who is allowed to do these things happens at Git, but you roll from Git. This model is what every company is looking for, every enterprise is looking for. And no, I'm seeing it in action, man. I mean, we're selling this today, and I'm confident that this model, and I think all of us are agreeing on this call, this is the model that's going to be with us for the next 5 to 7 years. This is not going away anytime soon.
Right. Ritesh, let me ask you a follow-up to that, though.
Yeah.
As one guy once said to me, he said, it's all great if all the configurations work, but what happens is instead of being wrong once, I'm now potentially wrong at scale because I've got a misconfiguration being promulgated out through 10, 20, 30 clusters or whatever it may be. So how do I kind of prevent the original sin from being distributed across everything and creating more havoc than it might have if it was just limited to one dev team and one cluster?
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. And I think there's obviously GitOps is great, and there's a lot of positives and benefits, but there are limitations, right? Like I think what we see, one of the kind of scenarios we see where when you start needing some change or something different in a different environment, whether it's a cluster, whether it's an application, even in case of policies, if you want to run policies in an enforce mode versus an audit mode in different clusters, you need to kind of, it's essentially a pull request and kind of a change that you need to start committing, and now you need to start tracking what goes where. So there's a lot of overhead and bookkeeping, right? And you end up with, if you're using branching strategy, you end up using with a proliferation of branches. So there's some of those challenges that we end up seeing, with GitOps. Some of those can be, obviously mitigated using some of the best practices. With policies, what we kind of, the way we see it help in these scenarios is, some of these misconfigurations, enabling or allowing policies to kind of correct those misconfigurations can help, right? In Kyverno, for example, you can not only mutate configuration, you can also generate new configuration, which I believe something like an OPA doesn't allow, or today doesn't support. But that's really where what we are seeing in the community, the automation, right? The governance, kind of, helping not just kind of detect and validate, but also fix things or change things on demand if needed, right? If something is misconfigured, having a policy that can auto-correct it or generate some missing configuration if it is required, and that can address this scenario instead of kind of trying to do that at Git level. So that's something we see definitely in the community.
All right. Rachel, how do I do that in a multi-cloud world? Because we have a question here from one of our attendees who's asking about governance in AWS specifically. But I think the trade-off of the balance is sometimes you're trying to figure out how to apply governance across multiple clouds. And while Kubernetes has some standard set of APIs, the clouds themselves have little extensions and nuances that can trip you up. So what should I be on the lookout for?
I think what helps with that, going back to that GitOps conversation we just had is, we see that people spend a lot more time and money when they are correcting problems that are already in the cluster. So regardless if it's in any cloud, it's much easier, cheaper, and it takes less time if we can shift that left into the CI portion of the pipeline or at the GitOps stage. And so being able to set that policy up then, things like mutating webhooks are good, but if we're mutating something, we can also just shift that left and just, put that policy in place at the CI level. And so that way, regardless of, anything you check into Git, it's going to check to make sure, do I have resource limits and requests so that my cluster will be reliable and stable, won't cost too much money. You can check that before it even gets deployed. It doesn't matter whether you're going to AWS or to every cloud out there. You can catch it early. And so then deployment is what happens afterwards. So you can get a developer early, stop them in that flow and get them to follow the best practice, so that then when they make that update, then it can be deployed to any cloud. And at that point, you can plug in clouds that will exist 5 years from now. As long as you can figure out how to deploy it then at that time, we already know how to check things in. So we can get that stage settled. And then after that, it's a different issue at that point. So I think shifting left is the way to go, certainly with multi-cloud. It's the most efficient.
Just to add to that, and I think maybe just reading this question, governance in AWS. So there are, with Kubernetes, even though kind of the API is common across all the clouds, there are very cloud specific kind of, whether it's add-ons or whether it's configurations that are required. Just to give you an example, in AWS, if you want to access any AWS resource from your pod, you need to add an annotation to service account so that there is a role assigned to your pod which can then access that resource, right? Versus that's not something that you would do in a Google cloud, or maybe it's different in Google or Azure. So these things like these are really kind of become interesting, and from a multi-cloud standpoint, managing these centrally through policies makes sense, because if you start doing this at Git level, now you have configuration for each of these clouds, and also you may not know where that application is going to get deployed, which namespace necessarily, and things of that nature. So there is some information that's only available at runtime, and it makes sense to kind of have these guardrails inside the cluster. But yeah, I mean, you just have to decide based on what you're trying to do.
Yeah, if you don't mind maybe adding to that point, and actually this is a really important point, because a lot of I would say developers and organizations who are just getting started with the cloud native, they think that they have to have everything left and they have to start there. But as Ratish mentioned, actually, and Rachel also hinted, that you can actually start from the far right, from your runtime environment. For technical reasons, like there's few things that you cannot discover unless the container is actually running. And also for some organization and maturity reasons. Ideally, you should have everything started as code, but many organizations, let's face the reality, they start with just going to the console, they provision their Kubernetes with AKS, EKS, whatever the distribution that they're using, and they start deploying their applications from there. And we face that a lot as well. Some companies come to us and say, well, do I need to have everything shifted left before I can apply any kind of governance? Well, we tell them, ideally you should, but this should not stop you. You can still start at the runtime. And that's also another thing that we're covering. We have an agent that's acting as a gatekeeper, always monitoring the runtime. And actually, as a matter of fact, ideally, you should have your governance applied everywhere, a commit time, a build time, and a run time. But where you start depends on the factors that I just mentioned. At the very least, if you do not have infrastructure as code and everything as code, you can start with the runtime, protect your runtime. This is where you should start because this is the most important piece at least. And then start gradually shifting everything left.
All right. Rachel, I'm going to follow up on that because I think what Mo said is at least that the males of the species neither read nor follow directions. So as we kind of look at this whole space, though, is deploying Kubernetes different in the cloud than it would be all the way out to the edge? There's also at the local data center. And do I need a different way of thinking about governing all those things based on where they're deployed and what that local environment kind of looks like?
Yeah, it's a good point. I think it depends on, when we think about Kubernetes in the edge or at the edge, it's going to have different constraints than it might elsewhere. Like if it's in the cloud, you can, it's not unlimited, but you can just keep getting more and more resources or scaling out horizontally. But if you're at the edge, say you are, in a building somewhere on physical hardware, there's only so many resources you can use. So if you do want to set guardrails or governance in place there, now we have these new constraints that we'd have to think about that we didn't otherwise. Making our resources or making our applications that we deploy into the cluster more efficient is more important when we can't just continue to get more resources. So it is an interesting, there's some interesting new problems there. And I feel like constraints is how I think about it. What are the constraints and what type of governance could I put there to help with that?
You guys agree with that? Do you think that there's a different way of thinking about the edge?
I think this question you asked and the one before, maybe there's one thing sort of getting conflated here. So there's the Kubernetes layer. And again, this is such a strong technical kind of group of people, and I kind of feel like I'm just kind of saying stupid things as a sales guy, but there's Kubernetes, there's add-ons on Kubernetes, and then there's apps. That's just how people think, and those are the facts. So once I have an EKS, I do this demo a lot. I'll have an EKS cluster, an AKS cluster, and then a cluster running in a data center in San Jose. And I give people, we'll do this in like a simple POC. Here's a kubeconfig file, connect to all of them. Tell me which one is which. Who cares? It's all the same. Because once it's up, it's all the same because I set up the right policy, I set up the right add-ons, and depending on the environment, the right add-ons would be deployed. And this could be edge. We have a use case in production where the customer runs their backend in AWS and EKS, but then they have clusters running on cruise ships. And the same CI/CD pipeline deploys to both. And there's no difference. The developer doesn't care. It just works, right? Because the way this customer's thought about it, and the way we would encourage any customer to think about this problem is, first of all, for Kubernetes, make sure at the infrastructure layer you've thought about the right policies and the constraints and anything you want to think about. And then on top of that, you have a pipeline methodology, whatever it is, and it's going to deploy. And so long as you've thought about it in a pull way versus a push way, because getting into a cruise ship, in the middle of the ocean, it's actually hard. There's no VPN. You'll be fine. Right. So I think, firstly, so long as we've thought about the infrastructure layer and the application layer, sort of kind of two different things that the applications kind of sit on top, that's also a problem in my mind. And then actually that same problem also solves the Kubernetes at the edge problem. Because if, let's say, you're deploying an application and some microservices run at the edge and some microservices run in the core, you're not going to have two different pipelines. You're not going to have two different systems, right? That's not practical. And at that point, to Rachel's point, so long as the right placement logic is in place. So one of the things that we spent a lot of time in the early days of our company kind of thinking about was placement methodologies. What is the right place to run the right application at the right time? And it's an important question. People think about it today manually. We've tried to automate it. Like, for example, there could be a time of day policy, or this could be like this application, it requires making it up 4 cores, and each of my edges is running, these are running 2 cores, but these ones are running 8. So there's no point in trying to deploy it on the one that's running 2 cores. It's going to fail, right? So long as the system understands that, it's actually going to make your life better, right? So I think there's a layer of logic, this automation logic, which is actually aware of their target that exists now, right? So companies do this now, we do this, others do this now. That when you bring all these ideas together, it actually makes the life of the developers easy, because the system is actually making decisions for them. Hey, you are trying to deploy this application in these 4 targets. It's not going to work because there's not enough compute available right now. Why are you doing this? And that error can go back all the way back to the developer, so they can make better decisions, Mike. This is also, again, anything that I say on this call, I'm speaking to a product, right? So I've seen this, we do this, again, others do this also. This is not like, only Rafi is doing this, to be honest with you. I think these are now practically solved problems, right? Where, again, infrastructure is treated as its own layer. And sometimes the team that manages the infrastructure is different from the application team anyway. And then there's an application team which is solving a different problem because their job is deployment. And at that point, some of these abstractions actually work to our benefit, in that whether it's an edge cluster or an EKS cluster or an AKS cluster, doesn't really matter. It sort of works itself out because you've made the right decision. That's how I'm seeing, at least customers want to do it this way. So long as any of the vendors in this market, if you're addressing the problem in the way I described, you're going to have customers, because in my opinion, this is how enterprises think about the problem. Because enterprise this is not one blob. To them, Kubernetes is not a blob. There's multiple different teams that work on a cluster, and you have to help them think that way. They have so many different people connecting to this one cluster. If you don't help them sort that out, they're not going to buy from you. They're not going to use your product.
So Rachel, following up on that, how often do you see organizations thinking about all that beforehand? Or how often do you think I think it was Hasib's earlier point, where a lot of times different little units are moving down the path at a different pace, and they have different levels of maturity. And at some point, then they got to go back in and clean up the governance mess that was merged because nobody had this conversation that he's describing beforehand. So how often is there forethought, and how often is it just kind of ad hoc?
It's a good question. And I think it varies. I feel like we do see more people that are, certainly with Kubernetes, trying to, I guess we break it apart versus like, do we have like a production cluster, a development cluster? And hopefully people figure out those things in the development clusters so that by the time they're in production, they do have these guardrails in place. And that's when, as you get to larger organizations, you certainly will have security teams that are going to create some guardrails and say, we don't want things in the cluster if there are vulnerabilities of, some vulnerabilities are just, you can't get every single vulnerability out. There's just always more and more coming at a pretty quick rate. And so we can certainly set thresholds. And I feel like at larger organizations, it tends to be a little more thought out, or it's something that's thought, some time has been put into it before the case. But yeah, it kind of just varies, I guess.
All right. Justin, are you seeing the same thing? Because a lot of times, I'll talk to developers who are just flat out saying they're trying to program the IT operations folks out of existence because it's just too much friction and too much headache. So they're basically converging all these capabilities into one motion. I think that there are maybe smaller companies or ISVs that can do that, but are there people who need to separate, or are you starting to see more convergence?
I think definitely the full spectrum. I think everyone's obviously following some maturity curve. There is a limit to how much you can pull left at the Kubernetes level, right? Because there are, even when it comes to, especially for example, the audit process itself. So the audit process is a dialogue between ideally some sort of third-party auditor and some team that's providing evidence. Okay, and so even just the act of responding to those audit evidence requests and retrieving some information about Hasib's access on that day, for example, you're not going to hand the auditor necessarily the tools to these governance systems, right? So there's going to be a human in the loop somewhere at that phase of it minimally. Yeah, I mean, the more you can push into automation, you're going to get leverage on those interactions, but you're not going to be able to delete the role of someone that understands and can respond to interrogation around how the system is configured, how it's supposed to work, how it has been working.
So Mo, instead of maybe shifting left, perhaps we are saying that the organization as a whole needs to lean left. And if that's the case, what is the role of a compliance and a security team in a world that needs them to shift or at least lean more left rather than shifting responsibility for everything left?
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, here's what the pattern that I see actually taking place in the market right now. Pretty much as the cloud disrupted how we do the ops 10 years ago, the same is happening to security and governance right now. So when the cloud came in and introduced infrastructure as code, and then automation started to pile up and build on top of this idea, the same thing is happening right now for governance, and with all its derivatives, policy as code, security as code, everything. And what I see, the pattern that I'm seeing now in the market that's being developed, and it's going to take a while for us to reach the same maturity level that we have right now in infrastructure as code, that security engineers, governance, anyone who's responsible for that function, they need to, get into the space of automating it. And the best way to automate that is codifying it, writing code, governance as code, policy as code, security as code, and so on. Yes, you need to be pragmatic and start with whatever you are right now, but eventually everything would be converted to be as code. And the way that I think about governance and policy as code, again, if I just use these software engineering analogies, is pretty much like functional testing and unit tests that you have to do for your infrastructure and for different layers in your stack. You do not do the test at runtime. Ideally, you do this at build time as early as possible. So the same thing is going to happen for policy as code and governance, etc. So they need to start whatever they are right now, but gradually shift everything left. And that's not going to happen without codifying governance and making sure that everything is written as code. Otherwise, security governance in general is going to continue to be lagging. There's going to be also a monopoly of a small group, and you do not want this to happen, because that also used to happen with the ops, before the cloud. Developers, they have code, they can move with a certain velocity. They need to throw, behind the wall to the ops guys, their artifact, and they're waiting for their application to be deployed. And they say, you know what? We're going to work together, this one system right now, to write applications and deploy and run applications. The same thing. I think this is for security. This is the last frontier, I would say, that yet to be disrupted in this space, the security and governance in general.
Right. Rachel, we see a lot of open source technologies across the board, anything related to Kubernetes, of course, and we're starting to see more security and compliance tools that are in that open source vein. And yet, if I look at the culture of the compliance and security folks, they are very much still, historically at least, relying on commercial proprietary kind of tools. So is there a change in mindset that needs to happen as they shift left in terms of what they think of as commercial versus open source?
I think it stems from the fact that it is currently a hard problem to solve, and there's no, it's just a very challenging thing to do on your own. And we started off writing a open source, essentially tool named Polaris to check for best practices and actually add the enforcement layer to it so that it can do governance. And we found a lot of people really like that. Like, it's a great way to just, have some easy checks, make sure we put these guardrails up and get governance in a cluster right away. And getting to the more like SaaS offerings or things that do cost money, I think because it is such a hard problem, people want to be able to lean on somebody and say like, hey, we have this issue, we need help with it. And so that's when, companies like all of ours that are here talking today, that's where we come in, because there is a spectrum and there's some open source things you can do, but it's still going to be a challenge to implement on your own. And maybe you can do it. Maybe you have the time. Not everyone's going to have the scale to be able to sink all that time into the problem. And I think that's where a lot of these SaaS offerings like ours come into place. And so, yeah, it just kind of it is, again, on a spectrum of how much time and experience do you have? And that's kind of going to put you on one end of the spectrum of doing it yourself or hiring somebody to do it for you or using their software to do it.
Ritesh, do you agree with that? Is open source becoming essentially a prerequisite for compliance, security, and governance?
Definitely, to an extent, like Rachel pointed out. Obviously, there's folks across the spectrum, and Sure, everybody has their preferences, but one of the challenges or that kind of open source addresses and nicely, especially when it comes to Kubernetes, is the fact that you can now define your policies, because essentially write your own policies. You have that flexibility, right? You may find, like in for example, just giving an example of the Kyverno community, there are like around 140 or so policies contributed by the community out there, right? So now we are actually crowdsourcing the intelligence, crowdsourcing these policies from folks who have encountered them, and so anybody using, say, Kyverno can adopt these policies if it meets their requirements, right? Because one thing we've seen in enterprises is there's lots of different processes, lots of different best practices, different. Not everybody kind of will follow the same, whether it's software development methodology or deployment operations. Everybody has some kind of nuance in their operations and infrastructure, right? So having that flexibility is important, and not having to depend on a vendor for that is important, and that's where open source provides a lot of value. But yes, you need for some of these folks, you need to simplify that, whether it's a SaaS offering, better command line interface, all of that is required. But open source does have a key role to play, especially providing that flexibility that is required, because there's no one size fits all, like we've discussed before.
Yeah. Steve, I want to come back to you because we're going to do round robin here for a minute. I think we have a lot of people on this webinar who are either newbies to some of the more veteran folks that are out there, but you've seen a few of these installations before. You've seen people run into these governance issues. What's the one thing that you would tell them to kind of head this off as a problem before it becomes too big an issue to resolve? Is there something that you've seen people do who are successful?
So, it's always fun to see the following play out in an enterprise, right? So when you start with Kubernetes, and one of my colleagues here actually make this statement, right? Getting going with Kubernetes is actually not that hard, right? I can get microKs working on my laptop, right? It's not that bad. And then once the clusters multiply, it becomes a challenge. I think the one thing that, and there's a word that we haven't used on this call, and that to me is probably more important in that it needs to happen first. It's standardization. I think that is probably the one place where companies end up wasting a lot of time. You deployed an application to a cluster and it worked, and then you're ready to deploy it to production and it didn't work. Now what do I do? Because something was deployed on that one cluster, it's not here anymore. The Kubernetes version is not the same one as the other one, right? That kind of stuff happens, right? So standardization actually ends up being the bigger challenge for enterprises. And there's a lot of hiccups. It's not working, that one's not working, something's broken there. And then they kind of step back and say, well, how do I standardize? This comes before governance. Governance is a means to an end, right? What is the goal here? The goal is, yes, compliance, and the other goal is standardization. Again, we haven't used that word because it's the other side of the coin, but I think that's where the conversation usually starts in companies, right? So if we think about standardization as a first step, and you want to do, I think Justin called it, or who called it, click ops, right? So I heard that as like, it took me 5 seconds to understand what he meant. But okay, you want to click a bunch of buttons in UI, or do you want to get ups, whatever. But there has to be a standard. Everybody should try and do things a certain way. Otherwise, how are you going to debug anything if something breaks? That comes first. So that's what usually my first meetings, I'm having that conversation. So forget governance, forget policy, forget GitOps. Hey man, what's your standard in your company? How do you do things here? What's the law, right? And if you don't have one, get one. And if you don't have one, we can help you come up with one also. And again, you decide you want to click ops or get up, whatever, doesn't really matter. You gotta have a standard. Just have a way to do things in a repeatable fashion. And if you do that, all these other things will become much easier over time. Otherwise, you're gonna have to go and undo a bunch of stuff. And that's never fun to do.
Mo, is that achievable? What's your best advice? Because last time I counted, there's like 100 distributions of Kubernetes, and they all have a little tweak of something here.
Exactly. Well, definitely what Hasib mentioned is correct. But I would like also to add another, angle to it, which is know where you are right now. What is your current posture as a result of not having a standard? Because this is also one challenge that I see, and I personally face with many teams. You go to them and you tell them you need to have a standard, and they would say, "Well, okay, yeah, it stings a bit right now, but it's not as a big of a problem as you're describing it." And they would tell them, "All right, take that agent, just install it, and let's see within a few minutes what is being reported." And then when they look at it, they would say, "Oh, we did not know that we have more than 500 possible violations and those security gaps that we have in our cluster that would basically screw the whole thing." So that's also important because there are two angles to it. There's the productivity angle, which is you want to make sure that you move fast and you have everything standardized so that you have some sort of control on governance. And there is also the more urgent angle of it, or the aspect of it, which is, are you really in danger right now? And this is important because at the end of the day, governance has to, basically build on business goals and make sure that your applications are gonna be and your business is gonna in a much better place when you apply these. So of course, standardization and knowing your posture. Right? It's known in the security space, the general security posture that you need to have that, but that goes, hand in hand with governance, because you cannot really measure, you cannot improve what you cannot measure, right? So if you do not measure it and see where you are, right, you cannot say whether I achieve my goals or not, and whether the standardization is going to help me achieve those goals or not. And that's also another thing that we're trying to do with the GitOps. A lot of people think at the moment that GitOps is a productivity tool. It just helps me to standardize things. But what we're telling them, well, it's going to help you fix some of those problems in a sustainable way, because you can still fix some of the security issues and governance issues. But every time you build a cluster, to Hasib's point, where if you do not have a standardization, in that case, the problem is going to come over and over again.
All right, Justin, are freedom and flexibility the enemy of standardization and governance? Can I have my cake and eat it too?
All right, so my response is to ask the question, what if we didn't use Kubernetes? And then ask the question, what if we didn't use AWS or Azure, whatever your primary cloud was?
I think, Justin, you should have started there.
And so don't consider any of these platforms that you've adopted a foregone conclusion, and then rebuild it intellectually and rebuild. Do we have a really good approach to answering these questions without Kubernetes? Is that approach cloud agnostic already or not? Have we accepted dependencies on Azure in how we govern, for example, systems that are outside of Kubernetes but are in Azure? Really just try and zoom out and think about how you have historically and how you might in the future. If you're ever getting lost, just rebuild your confidence in your approach by deleting and then re-adding the pieces that you've adopted, and see if it all still hangs together. And I think it likely will.
All right, guys, believe it or not, we are out of time, and I need to hand this back to Cody, but I want to thank you all for sharing your knowledge and your expertise. This was awesome. Cody, take us out.
I'd be honored to. So thank you all for joining us today, and thank you, Mike, for pitching it back to me. So I'd like to remind our audience that today's panel was recorded. So if you missed any of the session, you'll receive an email shortly after we conclude with a link to rewatch. It will also be posted on the containerjournal.com website at containerjournal.com/webinars, and you'll just need to look in the on-demand section. So our 4 winners of our 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. First off, we have Darwin M. Our second winner is Sarah J. Our third winner is Rahul D. And our fourth and final winner is Chrissy S. So congratulations. Keep an eye on your inbox to claim that gift card. And if you don't see an email, just check your spam folder. Justin, Mohammed, Rachel, Hasib, Mike, thank you all so much for being here with us today. Ritesh as well, thank you so much. I'd also like to thank you, our audience, for being with us for the entirety of today's presentation. Please take a moment to fill out our post-webinar survey, and we hope to see you at a future Techstrong Learning webinar. Everyone have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you. Bye-bye.
Thank y'all.